Welcome to the Tell podcast, where my guest and I will take you on a journey through stories and storytelling. There is a real intimacy in sharing tales by speaking and listening, one that is almost impossible to recreate through the experience of reading and watching. Join us as we explore the incredible world of storytelling. A lot of these myths, legends, folk tales and fairy tales have been changing throughout probably thousands of years, and they are still forever changing, and we realize that we also have to change these and revive these stories to make them more relevant to today. And that brings us to Klaus White, or should we say head author in Tell and master of the universe of
that's right,
of
master of the universe. Just stop there.
Yeah, why not? Why not? Little intro to Klaus. He is the founder of a website called thewayofthetortoise.com, which is very much surrounded around happiness, staying happy, one of the most important things, and there to us all. He's the author of 2 books. One is a journal of happiness, the other one being What the Tortoise Taught Us, which is all available on your website.
Yep, that's on our website. Yep.
He's a qualified teacher. Big interest in Shakespeare, and is also the director with the Primary Shakespeare Company. He's a keen musician, also a songwriter. What do you not do, Klaus? He's also an actor. Has been acting in the West End in the past.
Yep.
And more important than all, he's dad of 7-year-old Ava.
Yeah, that's right.
Who is or head tester of
she's
these
like
stories.
she's market research extraordinaire. Yeah. So
exactly.
I read all the stories which I write. She is the first point of contact.
There
so
you
she
go.
tells me. Sometimes she's a little bit too positive.
Is she biased?
I think she is. I think she just wants to say, "Oh, these are amazing," and I have to sort of dig deep and say, "No, but what can how can I improve it?" But yeah, so she hears everything that you're going to hear on the on Tell. She's the first point of contact for that. So
Very good.
Yeah.
Very important role.
So the story we're going to be talking about today is Sleeping Beauty. When you start digging into the history of this is a very interesting story, and quite ambiguous with regards to the morals, the themes, and obviously the versions that we know or think that we know, or the thing that we know are the traditional versions of. All of a sudden, it places a big question mark over that, and I think which is why I think it's a really interesting story to start with on the first podcast, because I think it just opens up a whole can of worms about what stories are, what they mean to us, why they've lasted as long as they have, for example.
An important thing to mention here is, through this series of podcasts, we will be taking one of the stories that we are reviving and creating more relevant and going in depth with it.
Yep.
and sharing some of the insights that we found in the process of it. And Sleeping Beauty being the first one. So yeah, maybe we all know Sleeping Beauty to a certain extent, or maybe we think we know Sleeping Beauty. But maybe you can take us through just the initial, the sort of the skimming the top of the story, and also a bit more of the background, and where does it actually come from?
Well, with regards to Sleeping Beauty, it's very hard to sort of know where it began. There is a version from the 9th century from China, which is quite close to the version that we know today. There was also a version in the 16th century, I think it was, which is very different and quite almost a horror story. And then we have the Charles Perrault version, which takes a slightly different account. And then, of course, the Disney version, which we know. And obviously, there are various versions and rewrites in between. And the one common theme is obviously there is someone who's very beautiful who falls asleep. It always seems to be a woman. So, that's the Sleeping Beauty. But again, I guess in future that could change. It doesn't matter really who it is. So the main thing is that there's a character who is put to sleep for one reason or another, for different lengths of time in different versions of the story, and then she is awoken, and then there is a happy ending. I mean, those are the key parts which kind of draw all of the stories together. But as I say, there are various different versions of it. as we were discussing before, the Chinese version of the 9th century is quite similar to the version that we know today, but the main character is put to sleep for very different reasons. It's because she's told that she's destined to have a short life. So now they think a wise character kind of says, okay, well, we'll put you to sleep for 100 years, and then after 100 years they wake her up, and then she lives, and so therefore there's a happy ending there. Interestingly, in the sort of 16th century version, which I referred to as the horror version, we actually have a character who we have the king comes upon a castle, sneaks in through the window, finds a woman asleep. We don't actually find out why she's asleep or, anything to do with why she happens to be there. He impregnates her. While she's still asleep, she has 2 children.
The normal ending.
So that is not really the version of the story that we imagine, that we know, but that's a 16th century version.
You omitted some of those parts in your rewrite.
I didn't. Yes, so that's an important thing to say. I didn't use hardly any of that, apart from the fact that it has the characters.
Maybe only as inspiration, but you're touching a few interesting things there. You mentioned China, 9th century. And how that version is more similar to now, and then 16th century being so different, showing us that these stories are forever evolving, coming back to its more older versions and then straying away from it again. But also the interesting fact that these stories have come to life in opposite parts of the world at a time where you wouldn't expect these stories maybe to travel so far. So have they traveled through oral traditions and from person to person, from China to Europe or Europe to China at the same time? Or is it more of a psychological state of people that are in certain times very similar in different areas of the world, and we have the same stories arise due to our trials and tribulations and sufferings and happiness? Yeah. Maybe we're more similar than what we think, and we were more similar than what we think, and hence why these myths and legends are very similar from place to place.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think nobody knows the answer to it, but essentially there is a human condition, and there are things that we go through in life. So obviously, past surviving, living and surviving and taking care of our clan or our community, there are things that we have to go through, and these things, I think, these stories have persisted because there are key elements of them which no matter where you're from, whatever culture, whatever country, whatever time in history, you can relate to them, and so that's why they survive. And also that there have been trade routes for thousands and thousands of years, so it's quite possible that versions of these stories have then travelled
along the Silk Road.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think there's an element of that as well. So I would argue there's a combination of both of those things. And then people, for example, I would say that most people wouldn't necessarily know the 16th century version of that, where the mother, the Sleeping Beauty, is sort of essentially raped in her sleep. We know the Disney version. We know the Charles Perrault version, which is a 17th century version, which almost looks like it's more reminiscent of the Chinese version than it is necessarily of the sort of horror story that we heard from 16th century. I think that's really interesting, and that sort of brings us to I took that as a starting point. I bypassed the Disney. I thought it was really interesting to go back to that, the 6th century and the Charles Perrault version, the 17th century, and take that as a starting point and try to include elements of that in the story, as opposed to necessarily going with the Disney version, because the Disney version, however great it is and incredible storytelling, it's very different, and there are some major changes.
That's very interesting, and let's get back to the Disney version more in detail. But before then, to what we tried to achieve with this, and we gave you the very possible but also impossible assignment of reviving this story of fairy tale, folk tale, Sleeping Beauty, and make it more relevant to today without losing the soul and the classicness of it. So talk us through a little bit on how did you set out on that task, and what did you change? What did you leave out? What did you include? And why did you end up on what we have today that will be told on the Tell platform?
Well, with every story that we look at, and as a writer, you'd go in and you try to take stock of what you have in front of you. So obviously there's a lot of information, there's a lot of different versions, but which is why we sort of centered in on the Charles Perrault version. And also I like the fact that it was the one thing I think was quite difficult with all of these stories is that the key to tell is to bring people together. And so in order to have a story that is engaging, it has to have those key elements that have, kept that story alive for so long, but at the same time it has to be of a certain length. We can't tell a novel at bedtime. We're talking about the age demographic we're looking at is from 4 to sort of 8-year-olds really. And so therefore we have to have something that exists within that oral tradition and that also can be used instead of having the traditional, the now storybook version that we see where you have the pictures and you have the story. This is just audio. And so there's an element of making sure that we are harking back to those, origins of the spoken word instead of using the pictures. So it's got to be engaging, but it's got to be short and it's got to have those elements that kept it going. So there's a lot of things to sort of pack in there.
It's a fast-paced world and we need to sort of cater for that.
I think one of the key things I wanted to do with this story is to go back to that Charles Perrault version. And a key element for me, again, I think if we're comparing it to, for example, the Disney version, is that all the other versions, apart from Disney, have this 100 years, which is the spell which the fairy puts upon Aurora or Talia, depending on which version you're looking at. So the Sleeping Beauty falls asleep for 100 years. Whereas the Disney version, she's asleep for a sort of a negligible amount of time, and I think it's days, weeks maybe. I wanted to include that because I think all of a sudden that expands the story and gives it almost more of a classic feel.
Difficult thing to do, as we talked about earlier, the world wanting something shorter but more packed into it. So you're set with the task of making something that is snappy and short, but spans a lot of time and information.
But at the same time, you can say, 100 years passed. You've done it in a couple of words, and then you're to the next thing. And I think with that age group, that's all they need, really.
So when we started working together, something that stood out in my mind is that you really wanted to build characters that were animated and fun to read, because the medium we're talking about is, oral storytelling versus reading something on paper with illustrations, something to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you can't rely on the visuals, there are certain things within writing that you can use which are in that tradition of storytelling. So, for example, when you're looking at repetition, so children love repetition because they feel that they know what's coming. And you can repeat the same, whether it's language, whether it's rhyme. And then, of course, you can then subvert that. So there isn't a huge amount within this story, but that's certainly something within the whole aspect of the Tell stories where we've had to use that repetition, rhyming, onomatopoeia. And then again, like I said, subverting that. So they think something's coming and then you switch it and then that keeps engagement. So I think that's key. Another thing is using the humor. And I think there are versions, whether these are movies or stories, where you definitely feel when you're watching them, there is something for the adults and something for the children. So obviously companies have realized, film companies, writers have worked out that, okay, the parents are going to have to sit through this. And so therefore we're going to give them something as well. And I thought it was a really key point, which we all agreed on, was that we wanted the children and the adults, or the readers and the listeners, to be on the same page and to be laughing at the same things and to find humor in the same thing. I think that's really, really key.
And I guess that's very suiting or fitting as well, because these fairy tales wasn't always meant for children. Through the time of the evolution of these stories, there were times that were meant for other adults. So I guess that aspect of it also falls naturally within the stories, and through its route to where it is today, that it should be for all to a certain extent.
So these stories are designed to be read. And so for someone who's going to read these stories, we want to give them the opportunity to actually sort of embody the character, and to try different voices and try things out and have fun with it. And if the reader is having fun with it, and then the listener is hearing that and hearing a funny voice and hearing funny words or different things that reader. So, for example, say it's a grandparent. They wouldn't normally say things like this, and suddenly they're saying that. That's going to create a connection between the reader and the listener. And again, what we're doing is really key about bringing people together. And even though it's a story that's going to be read, then when that child speaks to, for example, that grandparent, I love the voice that you did for the woodcutter, or that, and it gives them a real talking point and something to connect with, especially when those two members of the family are at a distance from each other, And I think if we can do that, I think we've really done what we set out to do.
Take us through our version of Sleeping Beauty, Klaus, and maybe touch on the highlights of what we have changed and why, and give us an understanding of what we're trying to achieve with the story, and also these stories will be available in its entirety on all our platforms.
Yep.
So please go and listen to it and come back to these facts and so on. But please, Klaus, take us through Sleeping Beauty.
I hope you started with Once Upon a Time.
Okay, so interestingly, I didn't start with Once Upon a Time, but yeah, that's a good point. I've tried to sort of not include that, but there was a king and queen, and they were good people, but they didn't have a child. And one day, good fortune, shone upon them, and they had this child, and they called her Aurora, which means the dawn, because it brought such happiness. There was a huge celebration, and everybody was invited to the palace, including 7 fairies. And these fairies came along, and they were allowed to sort of give their gifts to Aurora. So one by one, they would turn up, and they would say, I'm going to give you the gift of, it was grace and good fortune and a beautiful singing voice and all these incredible gifts. And then all of a sudden, a stranger appears, and it is the fairy Griselda. And the fairy Griselda has basically been passed over. She's been around. She's a very powerful fairy, but she hasn't been around. The king has forgotten to invite her, and no more than that. And so when it's her turn to walk up and give her gift to the Princess Aurora, she first of all says, okay, well, you can have all of these gifts that the other fairies have given, and then she loses her mind and says, but if she, pricks her finger on a spindle, then she will die. And then, of course, obviously there's chaos. She disappears. There's chaos in the castle. Nobody knows what to do. Thankfully, there was one more fairy who steps forward, who says, okay, I can't stop what's happened. I'm not powerful enough to stop Griselda's curse, but I can change it. So instead of the Aurora potentially dying if she pricks her finger on a spinning wheel or spindle, she then says, okay, well, look, she will only fall asleep for 100 years, which doesn't sound like a great solution, really, for the king and queen, but that's all she can do.
Better than dying.
But she has a plan. What's sorry?
Better than dying.
Better than dying, okay. But of course, at this point, they don't know quite what's going to happen. So she is allowed to give her gift. So now, of course, the king and the queen are paranoid, and so the king and the queen decide that they will destroy all of the spindles and all of the spinning wheels in the land, which they do. So the Aurora then lives for 16 years. Thankfully, she lasts that long, and then around 16, she finds a spinning wheel in the castle, pricks her finger, and of course she falls asleep. Now the fairy is brought back, and the good fairy is brought back, and they say, well, look, what are we going to do? And the solution she comes up with, which is again is very different from other versions, but the solution she comes up with is the only thing I can do, if you want to see your daughter again, is to put you to sleep for 100 years. So she's asleep, you're asleep, and that way when you all wake up after 100 years, then you will have a life, and that is a possible future, not necessarily a happy ending, but that's what we've got. They have no choice, so they agree to that, but they are slightly worried that they're going to be found. I mean, God, they're going to be asleep for 100 years. They're going to be in danger. You know, anyone can come in. So then, of course, the fairy says, don't worry, I will build this incredible forest around you. No one will ever be able to, you know, will get through that forest, so you will be safe. So they agree. The fairy does her magic. She puts them to sleep, but not just the king and queen, everyone within the castle. So the servants, the butlers, the cooks, everyone there. So everyone is asleep. They are all then sort of cocooned in this forest. 100 years pass. And the prince, of course, after this time, there is a new king and a new queen, 100 years later. And their son, the prince, is there with his two friends, and they're hunting in the forest. And they see in the distance, way beyond, beyond where they can actually get to. They can see this castle, and then essentially, the forest then opens up, and the king, and the prince is able to walk through. And no one at this point knows quite why this is happening, but obviously this is something magical happening. He finds his way through. He comes to a clearing. He sees all these people asleep. He sees the castle. He makes his way up to the tower. As he walks in, she wakes up, because there is an element of the spell, which is, you know, when a prince arrives or a king arrives, then she will wake up. So she wakes up. She suddenly remembers that her father and her mother are still there. So she rushes through. They've all woken up. There's a beautiful reunion. Of course, the forest then disappears because the magic is over. The 100 years curse is over. The forest disappears. And then the prince's friends come with the king. And then we have an interesting situation where you have two sets of kings and queens together. And of course, of the same land. And that's an interesting point, because then who is the king? Who's the rightful king when they both are? And then we have a situation where it sort of ends on a cliffhanger, as opposed to necessarily living happily ever after, because we have the story of a young prince and a young princess, and their parents going, well, look, you know, maybe it's time for them to take the reins. Maybe there's a happy ever after, maybe there isn't, and that's where we leave the story.
A story we all know very well, and
yeah.
and it's a beautiful version that you just told. If we go back into some of the key points of the story, what are the main things that you felt to leave out? What did you add? What did you feel you needed to change to revive, or not necessarily revive the story, but to move the story from 50 years ago, or maybe from when it sort of was cemented by Disney as the Disney version that became hugely popular back then, and why did we feel we need to go away from that a little bit?
Well, I think, and I love the Disney version, the 1959 film which Disney created. There is a character called Maleficent, and obviously when you start looking at the research, that is a pure Disney creation. And it's totally understandable, because, you know, when you're looking at a sort of a 90-minute film, and the tradition of storytelling and the tradition of Disney, certainly, there are goodies and there are baddies. And Maleficent is certainly, in that version, the baddie. Interestingly enough, in the Angelina Jolie films, which he's made after that, you know, we actually see a backstory and we see why she's as she is, and it's because she's been maligned. But from the 1959 Disney version, she very much drives the story. In the original, in the Perrault version, which we sort of took as a starting point, the fairy is just begrudging. She didn't get invited. She curses Aurora. She's angry. And then she's clearly very angry. And then she disappears, and we never hear of her again. So what's interesting is that Maleficent is there and actually creates this magic. When Aurora is 16, she creates her, sort of enchants her, moves her towards a spindle, and she pricks her finger. But of course, that doesn't happen. And so what I kind of like the idea that it isn't some sort of magic driving her. It's just almost a mistake, and it's not really explained in the Perrault version. And I kind of like that. I like the fact that she happens to be in the castle when she's 16 years old. She's lived that long. The king and the queen are obviously very happy. They think everything's going to be fine.
I guess to a certain extent that age and the sort of the explorative nature of coming to that age
yes, yeah.
takes her also in a way through onto a journey, an adventure, which is very common in these stories. And,
Absolutely.
And there is definitely a rebirth of some kind here as well, so that we can recognize from other stories as well.
Yeah, so she's going into a sort of a new phase of her life. So whether that's puberty or becoming an adult, or it's certainly a metaphor for that, I would say. But it just interestingly, so there's no explanation about why all of a sudden the king and the queen have decided there'll be no spinning wheels, but suddenly there's a room in the castle where there's a spinning wheel. So I guess they have to have their clothes made somehow. So but it isn't really explained. But I kind of like that in some ways. And then, of course, she falls asleep. And then a sort of 100 years later, and I think that's a really key thing. Having that 100-year gap is a really lovely story. Again, brings it the idea that stories last for a long period of time. And the prince finding her, and then I added a sort of an wizened old character who turns up and kind of says, "Oh, I heard this story once that there's a princess asleep in there," and of course the prince is intrigued by this, and then he makes his way through.
With making his way through this enchanted forest there, you did something interesting with that as well, didn't you? In terms of, in some of the tales, the forest are keeping people out. In other tales, the forest are keeping the ones inside safe. So what is it? Is it keeping? Are you keeping the princess safe, or are you keeping the outside world out? Or are there further ways of looking at it?
Well, there's so many different ways, isn't there? I think if we're looking at the Disney version, again, Maleficent is the person. She wants to keep Aurora asleep, so therefore she creates the forest. So the bad character creates the forest in order to keep the prince away from his true love. Because if you're looking at the Disney version, it's very much about Aurora, and they sing "I'll see you in my dreams," or wherever the beautiful song is. So we've got the prince and the princess who meet mysteriously and fall in love, but they don't know who each other are. And then, of course, they are kept from being together by the forest, which is created by Maleficent.
In the Disney version, he has to battle his way through the
forest.
He
has to battle his way through, and the Maleficent becomes a huge dragon character, and he has to beat her in order to, true love conquers all. And that's very different in the Perrault version, the version which we've had, which is essentially, time passes, things happen. And that forest, as I explained in the story, is created by the good fairy who is trying to protect the princess and her family. Absolutely the opposite, yeah.
But the same story, which is what makes it very fascinating, how things can be complete polar opposites, but still create exactly the same story with the same background.
Yeah, and you can understand why the writers at Disney decided to do that, because it's more impactful, I guess, because, and again, you want to fit it into a shorter period of time. And it worked as a story, but again, it's really interesting to go back to that original story and actually go, well, actually, let's have that as a protection.
Well,
as opposed
original story.
Well, not original. What is the original?
There is no original.
We don't know. But that's an interesting point. But I mean, obviously, there are other things within the Disney version. The idea that Princess Aurora is taken away as a child, and the king and queen decide that they want Aurora to be protected, so they give her to the in charge of these 3 primary coloured fairies who sort of look after her, and then she doesn't even know she's a princess. So you have 16 years where she grows up not knowing that the people who've been put in charge of her are magical at all, or the fact that she happens to be the princess. So she doesn't know. And in the Charles Perrault version and in other versions, essentially she it's very quickly passed over. She lives for 16 years. They've taken all the spindles away, so she's safe. So that's a major difference. So there was a lot of things that I thought it was nice to actually remove those and focus more on the fact that we've got a story where fate sort of takes over and things happen to you. And I think that's something that happens in all of these fairy stories. Very much, almost the protagonist of the story has to deal with stuff that is happening to them.
Go through that transformation.
And goes through transformation, yeah.
I think an important aspect to maybe talk a little bit about is also the ending that you have decided on, and how the ending has changed through the times as well to fit certain nows back then.
Yeah.
And we needed to make it fit the now and the people now. Even looking at the Disney version, shall we call it a bit sexist, maybe?
Yep.
Was there a time 50 years ago in reality where the prince was always the answer and was always the savior and
Yep.
was always, maybe not, but certainly not anymore. And
Yeah.
and we did do some changes there to fit it more into the now.
Yep.
And what did you do there?
Well, so there was the idea of the sort of happily ever after. And again, there is a version of happily ever after within this story, and you'll have to listen to the story to understand what that is. But it certainly is a different context to the traditional happily ever after. So the kiss, true love's kiss, that's a Disney invention. In all the other versions, I can't find a version where that is the answer. It is 100 years, and then when the king comes or a prince comes, then you wake up. But so I've removed the idea of a kiss. I've also removed the idea that suddenly everything is going to be a happy ending because of a man turning up in your life.
And it's not the prince who is the protagonist here who comes to actually save her. He is almost led onto
by
that
the
journey
magic.
by the magic.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And by faith more than the slaying of the dragons and the manly man coming to save this beautiful sleeping girl. And I think that's a very important change that's been made.
That's absolutely, and I have a 7-year-old daughter, and I think even though there are a plethora of, heroic female characters, if you're looking at Star Wars or Frozen, sword-wielding heroic characters who are female, which is a fantastic change. I think it's important that we don't have, when you meet a man, everything is going to be fine. You have to be your own person, and you have to, just partnering up with someone, no matter who they are, partnering up with it, you have to be your own strong person. I think that was key that we had that message, and I wanted to even subconsciously have that message within there, because there are certain things within traditional storytelling which I think it's time to let go of. Because otherwise those are the things that our children believe as they grow up, and however much they would like to try and change change the way they think, that age between 4 and 8 is formative, and so therefore why not take charge of that and actually give the messages that we want our children to have, which is essentially you are empowered, no matter who you are, what your sexual preferences might be, whatever gender you are. It's a really key message that we're all powerful, and what makes us individual is not reliant on someone else, certainly of another sex.
And it's also a very, very interesting ending that you've created, where you have a whole royal family who's been sleeping for 100 years, and there's a new royal family who's moved in and is ruling the land.
Yeah.
And suddenly the previous royal family, with all their connections to the land, wakes up. So ultimately you have two royal families here conflicting over the same land, which I guess is also a metaphor for the real world in some cases, right? And instead of solving it with war, you've decided on a little bit of a different route to how to dissolve and fix this situation per se. Yeah,
I mean, I suppose it's a little bit of a technique, but I want, in order to, you could, for example, have two battling families just saying, okay, this is ours and that is, I wanted to do that in a sort of a more light-hearted, light touch way. And so we just have those two families together, and they see their children together, the prince and the princess. And I think, as well as sort of resolving it, hopefully we've resolved it in a positive way. We haven't said, okay, in order to resolve it, the king and queen decide that the prince and the princess shall be married and everything will be fine. Because actually, in today's modern age, even though one would sort of keep a classic fairy tale feel, it shouldn't necessarily, and it isn't necessarily the fact that a father and a mother or the adults can decide the fate of the children. So I did want to put a little spin on that, and actually just, they discuss amongst themselves, they kind of say, well, look, it looks like they're getting on, but there isn't, and you shall be married, and they shall be, and she will live happy ever after, because, things don't necessarily work out like that. So I think that's a sort of a fake ending in some ways. It's a traditional version of what we know, but it's kind of a fake ending. And so something more relevant would be, let's leave it open-ended. Maybe there'll be a happily ever after, but that is down to the children. And again, it sounds very open and perhaps a little bit too understanding. But then I've tried to use humor as well. We've got a 116-year-old girl, and we've got a sort of a 17, 18-year-old boy. And there is a little bit of humor saying, well, I hope there isn't an age difference problem, because I thought that was a nice thing for the grown-ups to relate to, and that's something perhaps they can explain to their children.
An easy question for you at the end there.
Okay.
Keep it short. What does it all mean? What's the moral here?
Okay, how long have you got? Well, the thing is, I think this is a really interesting story, because what is the moral for this story? There is something that has kept this story alive and going for thousands of years. Is it that, I'm going to throw back a question to you, is it that good always triumphs over evil, and sometimes you have to wait for hundreds of years to do that? Is it sort of acceptance that things happen and then we have to find a way through it? Which again goes back to if you look at any studies about gratitude, is huge, which it goes back to my interest in sort of happiness and day-to-day happiness. If you can accept whatever situation you're in and find a positive within that, you will have a happy life. So that's one thing. Maybe I'm reading too much. That's just me bringing my own thing to it. But gratitude is proven within sort of scientific studies to actually make a difference with regards to happiness. Is it that true love conquers all? Maybe.
Time heals.
I think, time heals all wounds. I love to believe that true love does conquer all. So whether that is a sort of an attraction between people, I think it's more the fact that if you're thinking on a larger scale, if you have any question or any, issue, love is the answer. And I sound like an old hippie from 1969, but the idea is that, so for example, if someone is being mean to you or difficult to you, showing compassion, being understanding, trying to understand their point of view and why they might be behaving in a different way dissolves things. That's
going
love.
with it.
Going with it, accepting. Not necessarily accepting that, you are disempowered, that you don't have some kind of control with regards to that. But if someone is going through something, you show love, you show compassion. You show compassion to yourself. Love is the answer to any kind of issue that you might have in different forms. So I guess... Is love conquers all could be the answer to that, but not necessarily, the kiss from a prince and it's going to be happily ever after.
And also just watch out for sharp objects. That's mine.
And be very careful. Wear boxing gloves at every stage of your life. Yeah, that's it. And also there is the element of family. Look at in our version, and which is based on the Charles Perrault version, the family decided to make a decision. They sacrificed their own happiness or their own lives, and actually the lives of everyone within the castle. And what I'm going to say, if you're thinking on a real term basis, did those people within the castle have families outside the forest?
Let's not go there.
We're not going to go there. Okay, but the fact that the king and queen decide to make that decision to put their own lives on hold for their daughter, so that they can actually see her again, and so that she can see them again. When she wakes up in 100 years' time. So, God, there's so many questions.
And as we touched on earlier, this is our story. This is our version.
Yeah.
This is we expect more versions, and there's always going to be more versions out there. Some people are going to feel like something has been left out that was of so much importance to them, and we want, by making this version, and the reason it was written the way it has been written is that it shouldn't be written, it should be told. And we hope and will spur people on to use this as inspiration and tell their own versions of it and share their oral tradition of Sleeping Beauty and use us, as I said, as inspiration. So in that sense, not just narrating this story, reading this story, how should it be told? Do you have any tips? Do you have any sort of wisdom on how we should? What's the best way of transferring this story on?
Well, yes, there are some sort of elements that I think when you're telling the story can really help. Number one, at the beginning of the story, we touched on it earlier, the idea of once upon a time, all of a sudden. It's a lovely phrase, which is, again, we haven't necessarily used in all of the stories that we're doing, but once upon a time is something that you could just say once upon a time, or you can say once upon a time. There's an element of tension there. It's like something interesting is about to happen. This is a story that you can relate to. Or that is going to be interesting, or is going to be a horror story, or there's going to be interesting thing happening to the characters. And so I think using with your voice, telling that story, imagining that someone who is interested is listening. You can obviously read it like a shopping list, but if you're able to sort of inflect some kind of like, I'm going to tell you a story now, and this is going to be really interesting. There's characters, there's things that happen. And Once Upon a Time sort of encapsulates that brilliantly. So I would say the first third of the story is the setup. So you want to sort of create some intrigue. You can do that with pace. You can do that with pausing. So, for example, you could talk and then leave a gap. And all of a sudden...
Art breaks is very important.
It's like if you're listening to music, the silence is as important, the gaps is as important as the music itself, because without it, there is no balance, there's no impact. So using pauses, using your pace, making sure it's nicely measured. Then the second sort of third of the story is sort of the danger, the things that happen, that set it on its course. And that's a case of keeping up that pace and keeping the characters interesting, which moves us on to the characters. Hopefully the story has been written with all the characters have a specific voice. If you can, have fun with it. Try different accents. They might sound terrible. It doesn't matter. The fact
puts it to life that way.
Brings it to life, absolutely. So, try a Scottish accent for one of the one of the characters. Try a Geordie accent, maybe whatever accent you want. It just makes that definition between the different characters, and that gives them a sort of a life of their own, certainly for someone who's listening. So there's that. And I think that sort of encompasses everything. So have fun with it. Think about the pace, think about the pausing, using character development, use accents, have fun with it. But then also, and sort of the final third, where we sort of have the resolve, the real danger, and then we have the resolve. Hopefully by that point, all the work that you've put into telling that story has really kind of come into its own. But I think, and so you've got the engagement already, so it's keeping out that energy. There's a tendency when you're reading things, by the end of things, you might have lost energy. So making sure you've still got the energy that you had at the beginning and keeping that going right through to the end. I hope that helps.
Very, very interesting. And why this is so interesting as well is because these folktale stories, myths and legends, we all know about them. We think we know a lot about them, and they are very integral to our culture wherever we're from, that being Russia, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Norway, England. But actually there's so much more around them. And we will continue this series of podcasts and bring more of these tales to life and shed more lights around them and facts around them and what we've done to them to revive them. And the next one that we will be going through with you, Klaus, is an old favorite, I know, of Christo and Victor, one of our co-founders, Goldilocks. And we've changed that a fair bit. Still the same story.
Yeah.
Still very recognizable, but turned completely on its head.
I don't want to give too much away, maybe.
I don't want to give too much away, but yeah, it's certainly an interesting retelling, and it's probably the most fun I've had with the writing of the stories so far, because I think it's told from a. I don't know. Again, I don't want to give too much away.
Give us a little taste there of what you've done there.
Well, I see just a general overall overview is that we've got the character of Goldilocks. Let's look at it this way. She turns up at someone's house, makes her way inside, eats their food, trashes the furniture, sleeps in their bed. Essentially, she's breaking and entering. And I think
she's a hooligan.
This is the new version. Yeah.
I think that's it for today, and so tune in for next podcast where Klaus will also be joining us and going more in depth in that story and what's behind it and so on. So, but for now, thank you so much, Klaus, and thank you, Christo, and until next time.
See you then.
Thank you.